Good evening, folks. Silver here. Today we have a story of a red Crayola teddy bear and its relation to some strange and terrible events. What happened exactly? Let's find out. Also, before we begin, only a small percentage of you that listen to these stories are subscribed. So, if you end up enjoying this narration, please consider subscribing. It's free, and you can always unsubscribe later. With that, enjoy the story. I went to a therapist a couple of years back after my parents both passed away. I had some severe bouts of depression and decided that it was the smart thing to do instead of trying to kill myself. The therapist was your average therapist, I guess, doing what he needed to do, but it always just seemed to me like he was too nosy. He was always asking about my family, and I always told him I was uncomfortable talking about them. He always pressed the issue, so I finally broke down and told him that they were all dead. When he asked me what happened, I told him that I killed them. He tried to pass it off as a guilty conscience or something out of my control, and that's when I told him the full story. It started over 20 years ago with my sister. She was 2 years older than me. We'd fight over everything, as siblings do. This time, it was over Burger King toys. See, back then, they had Crayola bears, little teddy bears in different colors. They wore a matching shirt that had matching color eyes. I got a blue one, and my sister got the red one. At this time in my life, red was my favorite color, and I really wanted that bear. She and I fought in the back seat, and Dad told us to quiet down. When we got home, we fought some more, and then I decided to move on and play with my other toys. That night, I had a really good dream. In it, I was just surrounded by all my toys, and the red Crayola bear and I were having an amazing time. I would have woken up with a huge smile on my face if it wasn't for a blood-curdling scream I heard from my sister's room. Mum and Dad rushed in to check on her, and I sleepily wandered that way too, peeking into the room. My sister had a nightmare that the red Crayola bear climbed up from the foot of her bed all the way to her neck and started strangling her. She had thrown the bear across the room and cried. I knew that this was my chance to have the bear, but she said she wanted to keep it. After all that noise, all that terror, she wanted to keep it. She just didn't want it in bed with her. Mum and Dad put it on the dresser, and after that we all went back to bed. But I just had to have the bear. Knowing she'd throw it away if she saw it in bed with her again, and knowing that I'd be there to save it from the trash, I snuck in after she fell asleep and put the bear on the foot of her bed. I went back to bed and smiled, and I dreamed again. This time, the red bear spoke to me and said that he would make sure we would play together soon. I woke up the next morning, just knowing my plan would work. I waited to hear my sister scream, but there was nothing. I stayed in bed, my ear against the wall, listening for some kind of sound. I heard my parents wake up, and I heard Mum shout that breakfast was ready. So, I decided that I'd waited long enough, and I went to the dining room and got my breakfast. Mum asked if I heard my sister moving around, and I said no. She went to my sister's room and knocked on the door, and then peeked inside. I knew something was wrong because her jaw dropped and she ran into the room and yelled for my dad. My dad started mumbling and walked over, but when my mum yelled at him again, he heard the urgency in her voice and picked up the pace quickly. I sat there, eating my breakfast, hearing muffled voices behind the wall, yelling for my sister to respond. My mum started bawling. My dad came out, paler than a ghost. He walked right past me to the telephone. I walked into my sister's room. My mum was holding her and shaking her, tears pouring down her face. My sister's eyes were staring at the ceiling, bulging, bloodshot. Her head flopped around as my mum shook her. I heard my dad in the other room say that she was dead. I looked over at the floor, at the head of the bed, and I locked eyes with the red bear. Those beady red eyes stared into mine, and it was like I could see the bear smile. The therapist stopped me there, looking rather pale himself. He told me that it was all coincidental, and although the shock could have possibly killed my sister, that I was still not responsible for her death, and I shouldn't feel guilty. That's when I told him about what happened to my parents. I was 24 at the time, still living at home, working a dead-end fast food job. My parents had done the best they could, all things considered, but I was unhappy. My dad wasted money gambling. My mum, well, she pretty much shut down after my sister passed away. She was never all there after that morning, and she'd have some days that were worse than others. One night, I come home and my dad is stretched out in his recliner, watching the late night news and yelling that none of his teams won. My mum, she's sitting there on the couch, holding onto the red bear and smiling. The funny thing is that years ago we tried to get rid of it, but my mum insisted that it was her daughter. We couldn't do anything for her then, so we just let her keep the bear. But anyway, going back to the story, my dad hadn't heard me come in when he was yelling about his teams, and he wound up blurting out that he'd lost over $1,000. I didn't have any idea that we had that kind of money. Turns out that we didn't. My dad finally heard me by the front door, and had asked me to borrow some cash. I pretended not to know why, and asked him how much. He told me he needed $1,000. I was furious, but it was my dad. I couldn't say no. So, I gave him my savings. Every single dollar I was saving to get out of that house. I went to bed that night, staring into space, just full of anger and sorrow and everything. Somehow, I fell asleep. I dreamt of the red bear again. He had told me that it had been too long, and that he was sorry that we never got the playtime that we had earned. But he told me that he had some good news for me. He told me that our playtime would happen soon. I asked him what he meant. He just smiled and told me to hush. I asked him if he killed my sister. He turned away, looking down, and he asked me if I really wanted to know the answer to that. I asked him another question, one that I really only whispered to myself, and he answered, same thing. I woke up the next morning, oddly refreshed and happy. I remembered the dream vividly though, except for that one question. The next morning, my dad decided that he was going to take my mum to the doctor, and that he was going to go to the bookie to pay him off. They left, my mum smiling and waving the red bear's arm at me in the window. It was 9 hours later that the police knocked on my door and took me with them to the morgue to identify the bodies. Apparently, after visiting the bookie, my dad pulled the car out of the parking lot and into the path of an oncoming semi. They were both killed immediately by the broken glass of the windows and windshield. They gave me a box of my parents' belongings, and the red bear sat on top. Again, I saw that smile. It was only then that I remembered the question that I asked him in my dream. What are you going to do to my parents? The therapist? He was really on edge now. The color was flushed from his face, and he had broken out in a cold sweat. He tried again to tell me that I had an overactive imagination, and that I was just creating these scenarios in my head to feed my guilt. I laughed at him then. I told him that I had no guilt. The one thing my parents did right after my sister's death was getting some good life insurance. I made over $500,000 after they kicked off. The therapist stared at me, his eyes twitching. His mouth moved like he wanted to say something, but he couldn't. And that's when I told him the kicker. I still have the red bear. He dropped his pen and clipboard and told me that he was recommending an inpatient stay at the local hospital in their mental ward. I told him that that wouldn't be necessary. I was feeling over my depression. He insisted that I go. And then I told him that I dreamt the red bear said that if I didn't take care of the good doctor, then the bear would. I left the office and went home. I told them that I wouldn't be seeing the doctor anymore. The doctor didn't take any patients after he left that night. The red bear made sure of it. And every day, the bear smiles at me, more and more.